Welcome to this members education session in partnership this time with the Flatiron Health Patient Voices panel, looking at motivations, tensions and dynamics that shape decisions around data sharing, something they've done a lot of work on. In fact, this session has been entirely driven by the members of the panel. I've had nothing to do with this, so this is very much their work. Just a reminder, if you're watching this as a recording and you want to take part in these sessions as they happen, you just simply have to register as Use My Data member. It's free to join, it's free to take part, it's free to leave. So you can just register on our website, usemydata.org.uk. For the session, we know that whilst most people are generally supportive of health data being used to help research, there are still some concerns with some people about how their health data is used. And this session has been designed by the Flatiron Health team, describing some of the work they've done around that and some of the work that they do as well. So without saying any more, I'm going to pass you across to Brian, who can pick it up from here, and then he can drive the session with the members from there. So Brian, we're all yours.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Brian Kennedy. I work for Flatiron Health. Part of my job is where I manage our abstraction workforce, who are the people who help curate health data to create research-ready data sets specifically in the cancer care space. But another part of my job is actually I have the privilege to work with our patient voices panel here, who are an integral part of our business. They provide, a critical voice in how we undertake our day-to-day business, as well as how we engage with NHS trusts and maintain our partnerships there to make sure that we are doing the right thing with regards to the data that we have access to. This is the first part of a series that the panel have created and devised. Over the course of these sessions, the panel will explore the value of patient data sharing by tracing the journey from patient motivations and clinical impact to practical frameworks used to measure trust and organizational culture change. And ultimately, it should provide a roadmap for turning PPIE measurement theory into real-world practice to improve care. So, having said all that, I will hand it over to the panel. Jeff, if I can hand over to you first, please.
Thanks, Brian. First slide. Thanks. So this is just a very brief introduction to what this series of webinars is about. And I'm going to start by introducing myself. My name is Jeff Rolison. I live in the Midlands and I'm a member of the Patient Voice panel, a comparatively new member, having only joined in February. My background is that I spent almost 40 years working in healthcare, initially for the NHS and latterly for Pfizer, the pharmaceutical company, with a brief sort of 15-month interregnum in the middle, where I was what's called a mature volunteer with the voluntary services overseas, working in a hospital in Indonesia. And since retiring from Pfizer early last year, ironically, I've become a cancer patient. So having had lots of experience of, I thought, understanding patients' perspectives, I now find I have my own perspective on being a patient of the NHS. This is the first of a series of 3 webinars, I think, as Brian said, following on in May and June. And as Chris said, this is a conversation. We don't want to be just talking heads lecturing you. So please be prepared to input your views, your comments, your questions. If you have a really burning urgent question that you want to ask during the webinar, then please yell it out. Otherwise, could you put your comments and questions into the chat and they'll be picked up at the end. We're going to have a Q&A session at the end. And everybody's views will be aired at that point. So what do we hope to achieve from this series? Well, today we want to discuss why patients share their data and what impact arises. What are the tangible outcomes? And really, I guess, what's the point? And we're going to be looking at dispelling some of the myths and negative perceptions, some of the fairy tales and monsters that are lurking in cupboards and under beds will be examined and hopefully dispelled. Next slide, Brian, please. We're going to hear about real-world clinical impact examples. So where has the work of data sharing impacted, and the importance of evaluating the impact of PPIE and in data sharing and moving that dial from over there in the red to hopefully a place where everybody is green to go and happy with the service that they receive. Next slide, Brian. And as I said earlier, we want your input. It's a conversation, not a lecture, and everybody's invited to join in. And it's worth bearing in mind that your input is going to help shape the context of sessions 2 and 3, which are still works in progress. So what we hear today will certainly help to make those sessions more valuable to everybody. And finally, what is the Flatiron PVP? Well, it's a patient voice panel, and it's exactly what it says on the tin. As Brian said, it's a critical voice. It's a group of patients and lay members who help Flatiron react, respond to, and respect the voices of cancer patients in the UK in their work. It's all designed to help real patients get better care. And you can find an impact report on the Flatiron UK website if you'd like to know more. I'm going to hand over now to Janet to give us a little introduction to herself.
So thank you very much, Jeff. I'm Janet. I support Brian in helping run the Flatiron Patient Voices panel. My background is in nursing, and I also do medical writing. Today my role is to moderate the chat and look at and make sure that all the questions that you raise get answered. So I'll be popping back up at the end. So with that, I will hand over to Kaz to introduce himself.
Thank you very much, Janet. Yeah, as Janet mentioned, my name's Kaz Lalji. I'm part of the Patient Voices panel, and like Jeff, I'm one of the relatively new members. I've only been with the panel for a few months. In terms of my background, I've had, I suppose, 17 years of lived experience of having primary progressive multiple sclerosis. So I'm what we call a lay member of the panel. In terms of my background, I've been involved in MS organisations, I've sat on committees, I've been involved with pharmaceutical companies, public organisations, the NHS, and I suppose everything else in between. I suppose my day job is in digital marketing and AI, and hopefully today we can add a bit of value to and provide you with some information of what we do and I suppose how we can shape PPIE. And I'll hand you over to Maria just to give an introduction.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Maria Lawal. I am a patient advocate, patient expert with lived experience of osteosarcoma. So I've been a Flatiron member for over a year now. I'm loving it. I'm enjoying the experience, and I'm looking forward to talking to you guys today more about the importance of health data and how we can help surrounding that.
Thanks, Maria.
I'll now pass over to Helen. Sorry about the background noise.
Thanks, everybody. I'm having to work outside because I've got no internet today, so I'm going to put my video off because I've got low bandwidth. But it's lovely to see some familiar faces here as well as some new ones. So Helen Bulbeck, Director of Policy and Services at Brains Trust, but I've been with the PVP since its inception, and it's been a really exciting journey. So one of my key motivators, particularly because I've got experience of brain, kidney, prostate, and myself, I've had head and neck cancer, but dealing with a lot of rarer cancers, it's how can you use real world data to be a transformative motivator for change in terms of outcomes for patients living with disease. So this is my passion. This is why I'm here. This is why I love being on the panel. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what are the key motivations, what is the emotional stuff that's going on in our heads as patients and both as caregivers when we're thinking about data. And it's actually something that sounds straightforward, but is actually quite complex. And I think the decisions that those of us that live with cancer make when we're asked to share our data can be very complex. It might be a clinical record, a tissue sample, a questionnaire about quality of life. And sometimes it's easy to lose sight that behind every data point is a person. And with that comes our choice. So we're going to look at the motivations that drive people to say yes, the fears and practicalities that hold them back, and what genuinely enables sharing and what this means specifically in some particularly the rarer or less common cancers context. So the aim isn't to treat data sharing as a problem to be solved, but it's to understand that it is as a relationship to be built. So could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So why do we share our cancer data? So this is some top level data from the Wellcome Trust, but it absolutely mirrors what the evidence that Flatiron has discovered through the work they've been doing with the NHS Trust. I think you sent out over 85,500 letters to patients asking for consent to share data, and absolutely 98% was a positive yes. And I've had the same experience setting up a brain tumor tissue bank. It was 98.1% of patients said that they would be more than happy to share their data that sat around their tissue. So, and I think this data illustrates the key tension that our willingness is high, but that the systems and conversations that would actually actualize the willingness are often absent. And the gap between intention and action is not a patient problem, but it's one that sits with system design. So the 3 times faster discovery figure, I think, is worth dwelling on. The case for data sharing is often made in ethical terms, but there's a hard scientific argument too. Rare diseases are only solvable at scale, and scale requires pooling. Every patient who isn't asked or enabled to share their data, whatever that data might look like, is a missed opportunity for the whole field. We had an experience in 2012. I was working with Jem Rashbas, who was national director lead for data sharing, and we ran focus groups about patients accessing their records online. And one of the first questions we asked was, what are your concerns about sharing your data? And they said, well, it could be open access to anybody. And one of the last questions we asked to the same cohort of patients was, who would you share your data with? And they said anybody and everybody. So you could see the sort of misconceptions that are there. Can we go to the next slide, please? So what are the motivators? Why do we say yes? So altruism is the most commonly cited primary motivator, and it's particularly strong in communities where the prognosis is poor and the research landscape feels underfunded. I may not benefit, but someone after me will, is a powerful and generous position, and one that researchers have an ethical obligation to honour by actually doing good work with the data that we gift them. The second motivator is the accelerating research. Patients often understand the scientific case better than we might expect. Many have become quasi-experts in their own disease, and I think often clinicians and researchers make huge assumptions that we come into their space with no knowledge at all. So the pooling argument resonates, especially in rare and less common cancers where the smaller numbers problem is viscerally felt. And then personal benefit too, it's growing as a motivation, especially as precision medicine and data-driven follow-up become more visible. The rise of patient-accessible health records and apps has shifted expectations. We increasingly expect to see and use our own data, not just donate it. Next slide, please. And then, of course, being part of a community, being diagnosed with a cancer was particularly isolated. Particularly even more so with a rare or an aggressive cancer. It's profoundly isolating. So joining a registry, contributing to a cohort study, or participating in research can restore a sense of agency and community. I'm more than my tumour. I can do something positive with my diagnosis that can maybe not only change outcomes for me, but certainly change outcomes for those ahead of me. So legacy is particularly significant in brain tumours and other cancers with a high mortality. For patients who know they won't survive, that they're living with a life-limiting diagnosis, data donation is a way of extending their contribution beyond their own life. And this is deeply meaningful. And it means the ask must be handled with equivalent care and also gravity. And then advocacy too. Many people who share data do so because they're angry about delayed diagnosis, underfunding, or poor quality of life during treatment. They're not having the right conversations with their clinical team. So data sharing is a form of evidence building. You need to know how bad this is so that you can fix it for those ahead of me. And then validation, the simple act of being asked and taken seriously, matters enormously. It signals that someone's experience has value beyond the critical encounter. Can we go to the next slide, please? And I think it's really important that we do separate out these two areas. So fears and concerns are largely about trust and perceived risk, insurance, employment discrimination, and not imaginary worries. And oftentimes they'll come, when somebody's financial productivity is really compromised because they're no longer able to work or they're having to access benefits. So in some contexts, they're real, and consent processes should address these explicitly. Distrust of commercial use is increasing, particularly following high-profile controversies around health data sold to tech companies. And only in this last week, we've had issues reported about how handling of data in the UK biobank has not always been as it should have been. So re-identification fears are also rational. People understand that anonymized is not the same as impossible to identify, particularly for rare diseases where data sets are small. When we did the work with Gem Rashbas, we worked out that you couldn't go less than 100 people in any postcode area, because if you were able to identify the particular brain tumor they had, you would be able to identify who that person was. And then practical barriers are more about system design failures. Not being asked at all is the most striking. A huge proportion of patients who would simply share never get the opportunity because we're not asked. Consent form complexity is a genuine problem. Lengthy legal documents don't serve patients, and they don't serve good science either. And then the black hole problem, sharing and never hearing anything back, significantly erodes our willingness to give data in the future. Language and accessibility, important to name explicitly too. Data sharing systems built only for the literate, white Middle England, digitally connected, English-speaking patients will systematically exclude the most vulnerable. Next slide, please. So this is about the pivot from diagnosis to solution, what actually works. So trust can't be manufactured through branding, assurances. It's built through track record, through transparency, through consistent follow-through. We're not naive as patients. We'll ask who benefits, and we deserve an honest answer. Notably, trust is in the institution and the people, not in the technical infrastructure. GDPR compliance and data security matter, but they're not sufficient. And then transparency. Plain English is often cited, but rarely achieved. The standard should be, could the person you're asking explain it back to you afterwards? And if not, the information wasn't communicated. Reciprocity. This is an area where research community has most consistently undelivered. Annual newsletters, lay summaries, even brief updates. We want to know that something happened because of our contribution. And this isn't just good ethics, it's good science, because it sustains participation over time and holds everybody into the conversation. Meaningful consent, so broad consent, essentially, you can use my data for anything related to cancer, has its place, but dynamic models where people can update preferences, opt in or opt out of specific studies, see what we've consented to, generates higher satisfaction and arguably higher quality consent. And then patient partnership in governance. This is our position, what we want, and the evidence supports it. When we're involved in designing data systems, not just consulted after the fact, the systems work better and uptake improves. So co-design is not a nicety, it's a quality measure. Next slide, please. This is just one about my experience of working in the brain tumor context. So if you're diagnosed with a glioblastoma, there really is a sense of urgency because you might be looking with treatment at 9 to 12 months. So being diagnosed on a Tuesday may have somebody being diagnosed on a Tuesday may have strong views about research by the following week. They're in a very heightened emotional state. They've got to make decisions very quickly around their surgery. They've been told they've got a life-limiting disease. So actually consenting to using their data might not be front of mind. So the window to ask is short and motivation can be intense. So we need to have systems that are ready for this situation, not bureaucratically slow ones. And then, of course, with brain too, you might get cognitive and communication barriers. Cognitive changes from the tumor itself or from treatment mean that capacity to consent may fluctuate or diminish over time. So you need to get consent early on and then have a proxy who can be your voice for you. Excluding people with cognitive impairment from research participation is both an ethical failure and a scientific one because it skews data sets towards higher functioning patients. And then small data problem. Brain tumors, like other cancers, I think it's over 50% of cancers, are rare. Individual centers rarely have sufficient numbers for robust conclusions. And that's why international data sharing, using pan-European registries, for example, is not just desirable, but essential if we're going to make progress. And then caregiver involvement. Caregivers are often the ones who receive information, make decisions, hold the emotional weight of the process. So their relationship to data sharing is its own topic, and they may share on behalf of a patient. They may have their own data as caregivers, and their trust or distrust of the system matters equally. And then hope and desperation. When standard options run out, people become more willing to share anything that might help them or others. And this creates a real ethical obligations, not to exploit that vulnerability, but to be worthy of it. Okay, next slide, please. So what does good look like? Well, always ask, don't assume. The default in many settings is still to assume that we don't want to engage or to make data sharing opt out via a form buried at the back of an appointment pack. Proactive human asking, so humanizing the relationship by someone that we trust, changes uptake significantly. And crucially, a good invitation always makes it genuinely easy to say no as well. So the quality of consent is reflected in how gracefully refusal is accepted if we don't want to share our data. Plain language, we've talked about that. It's about testing information materials with real patients. It's not about dumbing down, it's about communication. The average reading age in the UK is about 9-year-olds. Most patient information I come across is written for a postgraduate. And then giving something back. This is the area where the gap between rhetoric and practice is largest. Teams commit to lay summaries, newsletters, finding updates, but then the pressures of research life mean that these things don't happen. So building feedback into the project plan from the start with a named person responsible makes it reliable. And then involving us in governance at the design stage, not the sign-off stage, having us on steering committees and data access committees in the conversations about what data to collect and why. That's what genuine partnership looks like. And the evidence shows it improves both the quality of the research and the willingness of future participants to engage. Next slide, please. I've very nearly finished before I hand over to Maria. So questions to take away. Are we making it easy enough to say yes? And that's everybody. Think about the last data sharing initiative you were involved in. How many steps did it take? How many forms? Who was the first person that you spoke to about it? And were they trained to have that conversation well? Was it a good conversation? Do we know what happens to our data after we share it? Not just in theory, so in GDPR data governance policy, but also in practice. Can the research team who wants our data explain in plain language where the data goes, who's analysing it, and what the output will be? Are we returning value? And this doesn't require a big communication team. A one-page lay summary emailed to all of us at the end of a study costs very little.
So over to Maria. Thank you.
Hi, morning everybody. So I'm going to be talking about dispelling the myths surrounding data sharing. So I feel like when we want to talk about data sharing and dispelling myths and negative perception, we have to, come from a place of empathy, because I feel like many people have hesitations in terms of sharing the data, and it's not from a place of ignorance or selfishness. It often comes from a place of fear and uncertainty. Using myself as an example, most times when we talk about data or our data as just a normal human being, most times, from the media perspective, it's always come from a negative place. Most times that we hear about data and media and news is mostly about, data leaks or someone has been hacked or this has been hacked. Even from the other day, I think I received an email from my car company saying, you're part of our member, but you wanted to send out a newsletter to say, something's gone wrong, the data has been leaked, but don't worry, we're handling it. So I feel like most people, when it comes to data, have a negative perception on data, and they believe, sharing my data means giving away my consent, or it means giving away my power, or sharing my data, especially, to commercial organizations. It means, they've sold it on, and so can Google me and find out what I do. But in reality, we need to support, people are less willing to share the data when the communication surrounding what you're doing with the data is vague, when it's not transparent. People need to be able to trust that, okay, I'm saying yes to sharing my data, but this is how it will be used. Is there, for example, with Flatiron, when it comes to the opt-out and sharing the data with various organizations, they have us as a SDE. Yeah, that's correct. Yes. that, so everything's protected, everything is secure. So when organizations are accessing the data, everything makes sure that it's being monitored, it's being shared properly. Data sharing not only helps the organization, but it helps patient. So me coming from an angle of being black and being in the black and brown community, most times most of the myths is like, oh, who's got access to our data, what they're going to use it for, is it beneficial? As an osteosarcoma survivor like myself, if people weren't willing to get involved in clinical trials and clinical research and give up their data, their health data specifically, and get involved in trials, I wouldn't be alive, because then most of the chemotherapies and medical devices had to be tested on people. But people had to be willing to get involved in research. They had to be willing to share their data. They had to be willing to go for trials and, speak about things that no one has spoken about. So I feel like in terms of data sharing, we just need to be a bit more open and transparent in terms of, letting people know that it's a collaborative effort. If you don't share data, then the companies out there that will be using it to, create medical devices or chemotherapy or create new innovations, how will it be more relatable to everybody if everybody isn't willing to share the data? So I feel like that's what needs to be highlighted more, instead of allowing the negative perceptions of data sharing. I feel like we need to be more proactive, especially in the brown and black community, of talking about the positive of sharing data and how that can help generations to come. Because it's not just about me and now that we have to think about. We have to think about the next generation, other people that are going to come after us that unfortunately will be diagnosed with cancer and different types of cancer. So we need to now be more proactive in terms of wanting to go into communities and educating them before we medicate them that data sharing is important. But we also need to do it from a viewpoint of being empathetic, in terms of them building up that barrier and saying no, or having that hesitation of why am I sharing my data. I feel like we need to fly the flag more on the importance of, if you share your data and it's out there, it makes it easier for us then to know that generations to come, years to come, when new innovations are being brought out, they are more generalizable to the everyday community, because then everybody then is being involved. Can I please have the next slide, Brian? So why does this matter more in terms of health data? Like I said, I feel like, for example, signing up to like different social media network like Instagram or TikTok, or I feel like everybody has been a victim of this. Like when you have the terms and condition and you read it and you just say, yeah, no one really looks at the fine print, but you kind of just tick it and you agree, even though you have hesitation. But I feel like with health data, people are a bit more selfish and a bit more cautious, say, no, if I say yes to this, how would that affect me? Who's going to be looking at my data? It's more personal. So in terms of being more empathetic, we just need to help people understand that, it's not about being fearful. It's more about giving hope to the next generation. And yet, even though, for many patients, especially in cancer care, it's not about just having your information out there willy-nilly for everybody to see. It's done securely, it's done safely, it's done in an ethical manner. And I feel like that's what we really need to highlight to the patient, that you will be using the data, the protection measures that will be put in place, and the real change that it will make for generations to come. So I've drawn this quote about health data is not just data. It's about people's lives. It's about people's treatment and people's chance to make something meaningful come through. So I feel like we need to really focus on dispelling the myths surrounding health data and making sure people feel safe. People know that, it's okay, and we need to be more transparent about it. Thank you very much. I'll now be handing over to you, Brian.
Thanks, Maria. And I guess this leads on perfectly into my short section where we try to illustrate some real examples of how data sharing impacts patient care and pathways. Obviously, I work in Flatiron Health, so the next few examples are examples of how Flatiron Health's data, which has been curated from patient records in the real world, so outside of clinical trials, to influence patient care. So the first example is something around label expansion for a drug called palbociclib, which is a breast cancer drug, and predominantly in breast cancer, it is a predominantly female affected cancer. However, there is a small percentage of men who do get breast cancer. Given the fact that trials, it's often hard to get representation in clinical trials of men. But with regards to the real world data that was available, Flatiron were able to work with Pfizer and extend the label to make sure that palbociclib in the use for men was safe to be used. So it was a previously small population that wasn't able to be studied, and then with the access to our real world data sets, this drug then became available to use for this small cohort of male breast cancer patients. And the second one, we've got a dosing improvement study where there was a drug called cetuximab, which is primarily in colorectal cancers and upper GI cancers. This drug normally administered every week, which required patients to come in once a week, get bloods done every week. Also in a chemo day unit, that means taking up a bay for around 6 hours. With the use of Flatiron Health's data, the dosing schedule was able to be spread out over 2 weeks. So people didn't need to come in every week. So they had an extra week back to themselves, whereby they didn't have to trek into a hospital setting. They didn't have to get bloods drawn. So whilst that was a much better experience for the patient, is also a good experience for the hospital as well. I used to be a nurse manager, and so being able to kind of free up this bed space for 6 hours in a week means that another person can get seen earlier. It has a lot of operational impacts as well as impacts on the patient themselves and their quality of life when they're under treatment. And then our final example that I've shown here is around a drug in breast cancer again. So it's around Kadcyla, which is a drug for patients who are HER2 positive. This drug specifically can affect the function of the heart. And unfortunately, some patients who have a kind of underperforming ejection fraction, which is the LVEF, so it's how strong the heart is, would have been excluded from treatment with this drug. With the use of the data that Flatiron had, we were then able to influence care, whereby these individuals who have a lower performing cardiac status are now able to receive this drug, but with increased kind of cardiac monitoring. So again, this is opening up this targeted drug for a population which previously would not have been available to. So again, these are those 3 examples of how because people have opted to share their data, that they can have a direct influence on patients themselves, then also on the kind of institutions that provide care as well. And so it's not really about academic, it's about giving real patients better care. And so obviously to achieve this, we require trust, which is I think why we're here today, and we're here and putting on this webinar. So we understand that the public should be provided with the relevant information to understand why we are asking them to share their data, what will happen to their data, as well as how we can influence what research gets done. And again, this is where the PPIE work that's the panel are undertaking comes in. And I'll hand over to Kaz.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'll be taking, like I say, a very short amount of your time, and I'll be handing over to Janet after that for the Q&A. So if you have any questions, please do get them into the chat box, and we'll address them shortly. So what I'm going to be looking at, or what I'm going to be talking about, is the importance of evaluating PPIE in data sharing. Next slide, please. So first of all, evaluating PPIE in data sharing, I suppose we're looking at patient and public involvement in terms of building trust in health data research, touching on some of the things my colleagues have already mentioned. We're talking about transparency matters when using NHS data. Once again, I don't want to go into too much detail because we've heard a little bit about that already. Patients want to understand how and why their data is being used, because I suppose with anything, why do you need it? And evaluating PPIE ensures engagement is meaningful. So we want to make sure that this public and patient involvement is adding value. So if you look, I mean, that's what we have. But if we didn't have that, we need to think about it. So what if we didn't have PPIE? What would it look like in terms of some of the things that's already been mentioned and the examples that Brian's just shared with you? If we didn't have PPIE, we probably wouldn't have made the progress that we would have done, or that we have done. What is happening because of PPIE? Once again, some of the things my colleagues have mentioned, and you can see things are moving forward. People, and it's helping people basically. Research helps, and of course, yes, we've always done research, but patient involvement is needed, and it's a big part of it. Next slide, please. So, as we've just mentioned, patients are a big part of it, and research depends on patient contributions. In terms of the roles of patients in research, it is growing, and patient data powers medical advancements. So in terms of the patients themselves, we have 83% of the UK public trust the NHS for their data. So that gives us, especially companies like Flatiron, a great starting point. Of course, we've already spoke about the different ways that we seek consent, but it does put us in a good position that knowing that there is the trust from the public. This reflects the increasing importance of patient and public involvement and engagement. Health data collected through the NHS Care, participation in research studies. Obviously, we're going to be. I'll touch on how we're expanding that, and public involvement and engagement initiatives. And I suppose, as you guys would know, as Use My Data put it, we all believe that our patient data needs to be used to save lives and improve outcomes. And hopefully this is where we're going towards. So you've heard a little bit about transparency from Maria, and how it's building confidence and how we need to do that to reach out to our different audiences. In terms of NHS data, health research often uses NHS data through trust agreements. Patients can opt out of their data being used. Obviously, for things like the NHS, we have that level where they already have the option, but from the examples, I mean, well, from the way Flatiron operates, we give them another chance. So there's no situation where someone's thinking, "Oh, I didn't know this company had my data, or I wasn't sure." We'll go above and beyond and make it as transparent as possible. Some organisations provide another opportunity to opt out, like the example I've just given you. And we believe, I suppose, it's important to have clear communication which strengthens trust in research. So it's not just one form of communication. There are several forms of communication. So it's not, as one of my colleagues mentioned earlier, it's not something that's just hidden in the fine print. Next slide, please. And hopefully this is like a bit of a visual example of how data sharing and PPI work together. So obviously we have the patients, we have that data that is held then by the NHS. Then I suppose that's where we come in the middle with Flatiron and the other organisations. So we will take that data, anonymise it, and make sure that it's available so it can be used as data. That can then be helping pharmaceutical and industry. And at the end of the day, it's resulting in what we all want, better treatments and insights. Next slide, please. And a little bit about, from my examples, or from my experience, I should say, there is a change in landscape in patient involvement. Yes, of course, we've talked about the involvement from the NHS point of view, but we also want to encourage a broader participation. So this may create challenges for people on benefits. That's one of the things that we found. So when my organization's working with people, they might have questions like, what happens if offering universal credit? What happens if X, Y, or Z? So with some organizations like my own, we offer alternatives as a way to contribute to the research. So it's then what I've personally noticed is that there is that growing recognition of lived experience. So rather than creating something that the patient wants, why not ask the patient what they want? And that's the area that we're going towards. And in terms of patient contributions, I think it was previously £25 an hour, but NIHR suggests a rate of £27.50 an hour. But once again, that touches on what we mentioned before on if people are on benefits. So there is an alternative. But what we're saying is that we're getting that patient involvement, but we are obviously providing payment for the time as well. Yes, next one. And I suppose this is kind of a nice way to end this this little section. The overview of the current options in health research. So we've got research participation, which we've been talking about through the NHS. And don't worry, you'll get a copy of the slides so you can have a more in detailed look at this. We have the patient public contribution, which I've just touched on in terms of other forms of PPIE. And then I suppose you've got public engagement, which probably you could even talk about web sessions like this where you're getting the information, and all three areas have their place and provide a great value to what we're doing. And I suppose the last thing I would like to say is what it does tell us is that this tells us something really important. The public isn't against data sharing, they just want it done properly, that's all.
As you rightly mentioned, what is the impact of PPIE? Like, does it actually matter? And I suppose in the next two webinars, or over the next two webinars, we hope to dig deeper into some of these contexts. So like, how do we measure trust and transparency in data use? So like, are we able to maybe like look back and say, okay, because of these events that we've put on, because of these education sessions that we've done, or the resources that are available, like, are we able to measure, from January, what are people's understanding of health sharing data, etc., towards the end of next year? Like, are things improving? And then in our third webinar, it's like measuring people, culture, and impact. So from like actually applying some of those like frameworks to measure the impact of PPIE work in general. And I suppose that's what I hope over the next year the PVP themselves will begin to do, right? So to track all of the work that they undertake as a panel over the next year. Like these webinar series is one example, but they also will continue to do work with Flatiron as we engage with NHS trusts. But there's always going to be other opportunities external to that as well that we hope that they will be able to kind of track over the year. And like an example of how we're going to do that is hopefully at some point after this session, we'll send out a feedback form to kind of gain people's initial thoughts and then hopefully track that over the webinar series. One other thing we would suggest, or if possible, it would be great if everyone could attend all three, because then we can hopefully track that experience for individuals. However, if you can't, Chris, I hope we'll be able to like host this recording on your website, so that if people do attend the next webinars, if they miss one in between, that they can view the other webinar before attending the next one. So
we'll certainly have it posted on the website along with the summary of this and all the other ones that you're doing as well. So we're probably at time, I think now. Could I just say a massive thank you to the Flatiron patient team who've done all the work and put the thinking behind this, and for Janet and Brian and Aaron and others for supporting them. I think it's been really interesting. I think this is just the sort of session, the sort of audience that we really want to do more of. And it's, from a personal perspective, when Flatiron started, it was fantastic that they came to speak to Use My Data and have basically picked up all the principles that Use My Data members define and actually made it work in practice. Remarkable work, really good. Thank you all for coming today. We'll put the recording on the web as soon as we've got it, and we'll put the posting in the newsletter so you'll know as well. And if you've got any other suggestions, comments, you can email me directly and I'll make sure that catch up with the Flatiron team as well. I think we're done. Thank you, everybody. Have a lovely weekend and hopefully see you shortly. Thanks again. Bye-bye.